On a single night in May 1991, over the course of about 36 hours, 34 aircraft, including Israeli Air Force jets with their seats stripped out to fit more passengers, lifted more than 14,000 people out of Addis Ababa and flew them to Israel. It remains one of the largest airlifts of human beings in history, and it happened so quickly. Community with real, painful consequences. Were they actually descendants of the ancient Israelites at all? Or was their Judaism something else entirely, adopted, absorbed, or invented by a population with no true ancestral connection to the story they had told about themselves for 2,000 years? That question was not academic. It determined whether Israel's law of return applied to them, whether they would be allowed to immigrate at all, and it triggered decades of rabbinic argument, government debate, and eventually one of the most fascinating detective stories in the entire field of population genetics. The Beta Israel themselves have a striking, specific answer to where they came from. The traditional account traces their origins to Menelik I, described as the son of King Solomon of ancient Israel, and the Queen of Sheba, a ruler often associated in Ethiopian tradition with the ancient kingdom of Axum. According to this account, Menelik traveled to Jerusalem as a young man, was recognized by his father, and returned to Ethiopia accompanied by a group of Israelites, bringing Jewish religious practice with him and, in some versions of the story, the Ark of the Covenant itself, still claimed by Ethiopian tradition to rest today in a guarded chapel in the city of Axum, watched over by a single monk forbidden from ever leaving the grounds. Other traditions connect the Beta Israel to the lost tribe of Dan, one of the 12 tribes of ancient Israel, said to have been scattered following the Assyrian conquest around the 8th century BCE. Outside Ethiopia, the community was for centuries referred to, often with a derogatory edge, as Falasha, a term meaning something close to exile or wanderer, and their neighbors regarded them as a distinct, sometimes suspect minority, restricted at various points in history from owning land, and viewed by some in the Ethiopian Christian establishment as practitioners of sorcery, simply for their religious difference. But almost as soon as European and Jewish scholars began seriously studying the Beta Israel in the 19th and 20th centuries, a rival theory emerged, and it could not have been more different from the community's own oral history. This alternative explanation, sometimes called the conversion hypothesis, argued that the Beta Israel were not descendants of ancient Israelites at all, but rather Ethiopian Christians, or possibly pagans, who had broken away from the mainstream Ethiopian Orthodox Church sometime in the medieval period, adopting certain Hebrew Bible-derived practices, likely under the influence of Jewish traders, monks, or texts circulating through the region, and constructing a religious identity around it that, over generations, hardened into a fully distinct faith and ethnic self-understanding. Under this theory, that more sophisticated picture began to emerge starting in 2009, when Sarah Tishkoff and colleagues published a sweeping study of genetic diversity across the African continent, examining autosomal DNA, the genetic material inherited from both parents, and shuffled across generations, across dozens of African populations. Their findings placed the Beta Israel predominantly within what researchers called the Cushitic genetic cluster, the broad genetic grouping typical of East African populations, closely aligned with their Ethiopian neighbors. A year later, in 2010, geneticist Doron Bahar led a comprehensive genome-wide study specifically examining the genetic structure of global Jewish populations, and this study added a crucial layer of nuance. The Beta Israel clustered closely with neighboring Semitic-speaking Ethiopian populations, the Tigrayans and the Amhara, essentially confirming the deep, centuries-long integration with the broader Ethiopian highland population that the earlier studies had already suggested. But Bahar's team noticed something else. When compared against the Oromo, the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, but one that speaks a Cushitic rather than Semitic language, the Beta Israel showed measurably higher levels of Middle Eastern genetic ancestry. It was a small signal, easy to miss, but it was there, and it was the first solid genome-wide evidence that something beyond pure local Ethiopian ancestry might genuinely be present in the Beta Israel genetic profile. The next major piece of the puzzle came in 2012 from a study led by geneticist Harry Osterer, examining the question of timing directly. Osterer's research proposed a specific, testable model. What if the Beta Israel community had indeed been founded by a small number of Jewish migrants arriving in the region roughly 2,000 years ago, who then, over the following centuries, were joined by local Ethiopian converts and intermarried extensively with the surrounding population, producing exactly the blended genetic signature the earlier studies had found? This model offered something neither the pure ancestral migration theory nor the pure conversion theory could offer on its own, a way to explain both the overwhelming genetic similarity to local Ethiopian populations and the smaller but real signal of Middle Eastern ancestry detected by Bahar's team 2 years earlier. Then, in research reported by the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, uncovered by the BBC, geneticist Chris Tyler Smith and colleagues identified evidence of gene flow into Ethiopia from the Levant occurring specifically around 3,000 years ago, a finding Tyler Smith himself noted lines up strikingly well with the traditional Ethiopian account of the Queen of Sheba's connection to ancient Israel, though researchers were careful to stress that a genetic timing match does not, on its own, confirm the specific royal narrative passed down in oral tradition. It confirms only that some kind of meaningful population contact and gene flow occurred around that period, consistent with, but not definitive proof of, the story Ethiopian tradition had preserved for millennia. The most comprehensive answer yet arrived in 2020, in a large-scale ancient and modern DNA study led by Ayelet Agranat-Tamer and colleagues, published as part of a broader wave of research using increasingly powerful genome sequencing technology to compare modern populations against actual ancient. DNA recovered from archaeological remains across the Levant, including Bronze Age skeletal material. This study found that the Beta Israel genome is predominantly East African in origin, consistent with everything the earlier studies had shown, but that approximately 20% of their genetic ancestry shows meaningful similarity to Middle Eastern populations, including a notable resemblance to ancient Bronze Age Canaanite DNA and to modern Jewish and Arab populations from the region. 20% is not a small number in population genetics. It is a substantial, unmistakable signal, and it is not the kind of pattern you would expect to see if the Beta Israel's Jewish identity were purely a local religious adoption with no ancestral component at all. At the same time, it is also not the overwhelming dominant ancestry you would expect if the community were simply a transplanted population of ancient Israelites who happened to settle in Ethiopia and remained largely apart from their neighbors. It is instead exactly the kind of genetic signature that Oster's 2012 model predicted, a real ancient founding contribution from Jewish or broader Levantine migrants arriving somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, followed by many centuries of extensive intermarriage and absorption of local Ethiopian converts, with the community's distinct religious identity likely consolidating into something resembling its modern form around 1,500 years ago in the mid-first millennium of the Common Era. What emerges from nearly 2 decades of steadily improving genetic research is not the simple, clean answer either side of the century-old debate was hoping for, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. It is not proof that the Beta Israel are a literal, unbroken bloodline from the court of King Solomon, preserved in genetic isolation for 3,000 years. But it is also not the conversion theory in its purest form either, the idea of an origin story invented from nothing. The genetic evidence, drawn from multiple independent research teams using different methods across more than a decade, converges on something more nuanced and, in its own way, more remarkable than either extreme. A real ancient connection to the Levant does appear to run through Beta Israel ancestry, likely carried by a relatively small founding population that arrived in the Ethiopian highlands somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. Over the many centuries that followed, that founding group did not remain isolated. It grew, absorbed, and intermarried extensively with the surrounding Ethiopian population, in a process closely mirroring the way Jewish communities settled and blended into local populations virtually everywhere else in the ancient diaspora, from Yemen to Persia to the Roman Mediterranean. The result, preserved today in the DNA of Ethiopian Jews now living in Israel, in Ethiopia, and around the world, is a genuine, if partial, genetic thread reaching back toward the ancient Near East, wrapped inside an overwhelmingly East African genetic identity forged over 2,000 years of life in the Ethiopian highlands. Genetics did not settle every dimension of this debate, and scholars still argue over precisely how to weigh oral tradition, textual history, and genetic data against one another when defining who counts as descended from whom. But it did, something that decades of historical argument alone could not do. It found, encoded directly into living human DNA, physical evidence that the story the Beta Israel had told about themselves for 2,000 years was not simply a legend invented to explain an unrelated religious conversion. Somewhere in that story, carried forward not in scripture but in the actual molecule of inheritance itself, there really is an ancient road leading back toward the Levant. For the community itself, and for the tens of thousands of people who boarded those aircraft during Operation Moses, Operation Joshua, and Operation Solomon, this is not simply an academic resolution. It is a scientific echo of an identity they carried through. Centuries of isolation, suspicion, and, at times, active persecution, an identity many of them were never permitted to simply take for granted. The genetic record does not replace the oral history, the religious devotion, or the extraordinary cultural endurance of a community that kept a form of biblical faith alive in the Ethiopian highlands for 2 millennia with no rabbis, no printing presses, and no contact with the rest of the Jewish world to reassure them they were not alone. What it does is confirm that somewhere at the root of that story, buried under 20s, centuries of intermarriage, migration, famine, persecution, and eventually an airlift across the skies above the Red Sea, there is a genuine, traceable thread connecting the Beta Israel back to the ancient Near East, one that survived not in a text or a temple, but quietly, faithfully, inside the DNA of every generation that carried the story forward. Carry your story well.